Turn to Damn Nature, You Scary on BET.
Damn, look at that sumbitch go. He hauling ass. That thing come by my house, I kill it. That little rat-looking thing just got ate. Damn, Nature, you scary.
Action News Network is an Aboriginal American media network. As such, we are protected under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People or DRIP Articles 8, 14, and 16. Action News Network is allowed to provide Aboriginal news and media content on non-Indigenous media platforms free of oppressive censorship. Any breach of this protection is a breach of international law.
Hey black people, let's play a game. This is Action Jack, Action News Network, and we're going to play a game. And that game is called What Do You Know About? So, today's topic for What Do You Know About is the Atlantic Creoles. No, not the Louisiana French Creoles. We all know about them because they can never shut up about how great they are and how they're not like the rest of us Negroes, which they're not. And they are a part of this Atlantic Creole culture and customs, but they're just one part of it. This Atlantic Creole culture, most notably, would probably be centered around Virginia and the Carolinas. They used to be called the Tidewater or Low Country Creoles, but largely they've been forgotten, and for a very good reason. And that's because these Creoles, so-called Creoles, made up a bulk of the Africans who were brought here. Something from 50% to even more in some cases. I read the bulk of these so-called Africans who were brought here to America as slaves, right? They try to group all of us in as. See, they make the numbers of these Africans being brought here very great when it's not as large as told. And if you just look at the numbers of Europeans who were just around and those who were sailing at the time and doing all of this grabbing up and trading and all of this shit, not enough people to bring millions, especially the number about 20 million almost from Africa to the Americas. But there was a large group of them brought here, and the majority of them were called these Atlantic Creoles. And a lot of these Atlantic Creoles were mixed race. Now, that's mostly what we think of Creoles being mixed race. But a Creole could also be a European born in Africa from two European parents, and then moved from Africa or from whether through be slavery or indigenous servitude to America. They wouldn't be considered automatically a European, but yet an Atlantic Creole. All right. Same thing if let's say a mixed race person, African and Portuguese or something, was born in Africa and brought here, they would also be called a Creole. Now, they say the Creoles also would be considered Latinos today. Which is funny since a lot of Latinos don't even like to admit that they have any kind of blood outside of, from Africa or anything else. A lot of them have more African blood in them than the majority of just normal black people. And that's real. And I'm half Latino. But just to keep it funky with you, that is what it is. So there's a lot of history not being taught here. Now, I'm pretty sure that probably 90% of people watching this video probably haven't heard much about the Atlantic Creoles. Again, not the French Creole from Louisiana, who are mostly Haitians who were brought there. Again, Creoles. Because another Creole thing is if you was born in the Caribbean, whether, again, white or mixed race, or even just black, born in the Caribbean. If you was brought to America after being born in the Caribbean, you would be an Atlantic Creole. The most famous Atlantic Creole is Alexander Hamilton, who would be by all terms, well, I believe he was mixed race, mulatto, but he's portrayed as a white person. But there's a lot of evidence that he might have been mixed race. Of course, a Carib Indian and probably either Dutch or English, being from Europe. All in all, again, Black history, nothing is taught of these Atlantic Creoles, who made up a majority of these people who came from Africa here. So, if we know they line about all of this shit, how do we know that a majority of these Atlantic Creoles weren't white people born in Africa who didn't fit into white society in Europe because they was from Africa, or either they wouldn't even fit into African society there because whites couldn't own land and shit in Africa, which is kind of funny, right? Considering how they just give this shit away now. But anyway, they would have to find a way to America, and usually that was through indentured servitude, or they fucked up over there and became slaves and had to work it off here. Okay, so there's a lot of this going on that we're not told about. So we're gonna dive deeper into that. Very interesting shit here. So stay tuned, and you know, it's a lesson, so it's not as visually stimulating as most of my videos are. But if you stick around, you're gonna get some interesting facts. And another thing I want to tie this into is the whole notion of the Moors. We don't learn nothing about the Atlantic Creoles, but when I look at the Atlantic Creoles and how they dipped and dabbed in between both societies, helped create laws, and were among some of the first politicians, you start to see that these people who claim to be Moors, who claim to both have ancestry in Europe and in Africa and here in America, by the way, and they seem to know the laws of these lands better than the people who come from these lands. They seem to dip and dive. They want to be white one moment, and then they want to be Indian another moment, then they want to be African another moment. You know, when you start to read the lessons on these Atlantic Creoles, you start to see that these people who call themselves Moors seem to be exactly what these people are talking about. These group of mixed race people who have some kind of secret bond that, you know, puts them over everybody because of how they ostracized by all societies. So we gotta think of it that way. I'd like to give a shout out to Lex Will, always inspiring me to, you know, reaching real deep and far, and pull out the best out of myself when it comes to these topics. So shout out to Lex Will. This one's for you, brother. Okay, here we go. Atlantic Creole. It's a term used in North America to describe a mixed race ethnic group of Americans who have ancestral roots in Africa, Europe, and sometimes the Caribbean. These people are culturally American and are the descendants of a chartered generation of slaves, indentured workers during the European colonization of the Americas before 1660. Some have lived and worked in Europe or the Caribbean before coming or being transported to North America. And Emmanuel Rodriguez is one of the more famous descendants of this ethnic class. The historian Ira Berlin, 1998, identified the arrival of the Atlantic Creoles in the Chesapeake Bay region in the 17th century. He traced the Atlantic Creoles to descendants of European sailors and traders as fathers and African mothers. They were born generally in the port cities of the west coast of Africa, where Portuguese traders have been active since the mid-16th century. They often worked as interpreters or go-betweens between Africans and Europeans. Up until the end of the 17th century, though, the first 50 years of settlement, lines were often fluid between black and white workers. Both worked off passage as indigent servants. The working class lived together, and many white women and black men developed relationships. Interesting fact, some Native Americans were also enslaved, and some Indian slaves were brought to North America from the Caribbean, Central, and South America. So according to Berlin, some of these mixed race Atlantic Creoles were culturally what today would be called Latino in the United States, as they were descended from Portuguese and Spanish fathers, primarily in the trading ports of West Africa. It has surnames such as Chavez, Rodriguez, and Francisco. Alright? Many of them intermarried with English neighbors and adopted English surnames, became property owners and farmers, and owned slaves in terms. It seems like everybody but the American Indian was allowed to prosper here. Another interesting fact I found, since we want to go into the African slave trade, the Kingdom of Congo, which is now present-day Angola, they adopted Catholicism in the late 15th century due to Portuguese influence. This led a to a foreign type of African Catholic spirituality. Adopted Portuguese names. The kingdoms were Christian for nearly 400 years, and numerous people from the Congo were transported to the North American colonies as slaves, especially to South Carolina and Louisiana. This is why you got a Creole kind of populations in these areas, right? We always know about the Louisiana Creoles. We also have a low country, a tidewater country Creoles here in the Carolinas too. 1 in 5 African Americans are descended from Congolese ancestors. So if numerous people were brought from here as slaves to the Carolinas, the people that they call African Americans, 1 in 5. So who's the other 4 and 5? Could it be indigenous Americans? Brunel says that the Congolese slaves, rather than the small mixed race communities, and this is why I spotlighted this, because this whole paragraph fucking contradicts itself. Brunel, and you'll see a lot of this in history where they contradict themselves in the same fucking paragraph. But Brunel says that the Congolese slaves, rather than the small mixed race communities around European trading posts, were the source of early Atlantic Creoles. So they saying that instead of these mixed race communities, most were these Congolese, right, who were supposedly just Africans who fucking just converted over to Catholicism and took on these Portuguese last names, right? So they just said that it wasn't really mixed race, right? So you continue on with this. It says these early Atlantic Creoles with Iberian surnames, meaning Spanish and Portuguese, in North America. Many were Christian, were multiracial. So again, you said they didn't come from these small mixed race communities, but then you saying right here that many were Christian and multiracial and multilingual. All right, so that's just weird right there. And familiar with some of the aspects of European culture, with Dutch colonies in South America, the Caribbean, and New York were also populated with numerous enslaved Atlantic Creoles from the Kingdom of Congo. This is from Slate magazine online. It's actually a good article. The Atlantic Creoles, America's first slaves, were subjugated as much for their cultural alienation as were for their race. This is from that same book that was being described in Wikipedia. So this gives a good breakdown of what they were talking about here. All right. So some of this is going to be chopped up a little bit because it's a lot. It says excerpted from Generations of Captivity, A History of African American Slaves by Ira Berlin. Alright. So it basically says black life on mainland North America originated not in Africa or America, but in another world between the two continents, along with the propriety of the Atlantic, first in Africa, then Europe, and finally in the Americas. It was a product of the momentous meeting of Africans and Europeans and their equally faithful rendezvous with the peoples of the New World. The Atlantic Creoles trace their beginnings to the historic encounter of Europeans and Africans emerging around the trading factories or fetorias established on the coast of Africa in the 15th century by European expansionists. Many served as intermediaries in its development crop of transatlantic trade in enclaves, employing their linguistic skills and their familiarity with the Atlantic's diverse commercial practices, cultural conventions, and diplomatic etiquette to mediate between African merchants and European sea captains. In doing so, some Atlantic Creoles identified with their ancestral homeland or a portion of it, be it African or European, and served as representatives in negotiations. Other Atlantic Creoles have been won over by the power and largeness of one party or another, so that Africans entered the employ of European trading companies and Europeans traded with African continents. Yet others played fast and loose with their mixed heritage, employing whichever identity paid best. Whatever strategy adopted, the Atlantic Creoles began the process of integrating the icons and beliefs of the Atlantic world into a new way of life. The people of the enclaves, long-term residents and wayfarers alike, soon joined together geographically and genetically. European men took wives and mistresses amongst African women, and before long the children born of these unions helped people of the enclave. Elmina, a Portuguese enclave later seized by the Dutch, sprouted a substantial cadre of Afro Euro-Africans, most of them Luso-Africans, men and women, of African birth but shared African and European percentage, who swarthy skin, European dress, and department acquaintance with local norms, and multilingualism gave them an insider's knowledge of both African and European ways, but denied them full acceptance into either culture, right? By the 18th century, they numbered several hundred in Elmina in modern-day Ghana. Africans and Europeans alike sneered at the Creoles' mixed lineage and condemned them as haughty, proud, and overbearing. When they adopted African ways, wore African dress and amulets, or underwent circumcision and scarification, Europeans declared them outcasts, tangos maus, or renegades to the Portuguese. When they adopted European ways and European clothing and crucifixes, employed European names and titles, and comported themselves in the manner of white men, Africans denied them the right to hold land, marry, or inherit property. Not all Tangasimos were mixed ancestry, and not all people of mixed ancestry was Tangasimos. Color was only one marker of this cultural in the making, and generally the least significant one. From common experience, conventions of personal behavior, and cultural sensibilities compounded by shared ostracism, right? American Creoles acquired interests of their own apart from those in European and African antecedents, right? Whether the Atlantic Creoles resided in Europe or Africa, it was knowledge and experience far more than color that would set them apart from the Africans who brought slaves from the interior and the Europeans who carried them across the Atlantic. On one hand, the hapless men and women upon whose commodification of the slave trade rested. On the other hand, maintaining a secure place in such a volatile social order was not easy. The Atlantic Creoles' limited, particularly their lack of identity with any one group, posed numerous dangers. While their intermediate position made them valuable to African and European traders alike, it also made them vulnerable. They could be ostracized, scapegoated, and on occasion enslaved. Maintaining independence amid the shifting alliances among Europeans and Africans was always difficult. Inevitably, some failed. Debt, crime, heresy, immorality, official disfavor, or bad luck could mean enslavement, if not for the great traders, at least for those on the fringes of the Creole community, placed in captivity. Atlantic Creoles might be exiled anywhere around the Atlantic, the islands, along the coast, the European metropoles, or the plantations of the New World. In the 17th century and the early part of the 18th, most slaves exported from Africa went through the sugar plantations of the Atlantic islands and the Americas. Enslaved Atlantic Creoles might be shipped to Pernambuco in modern-day Brazil, Barbados, or Martinique, and later Jamaica and St. Dominique, now Haiti, all expanding centers of the New World's staple production, right? But transporting them to these hubs of plantation economy posed dangers, with American planters well understood. The distinguishing characteristics of the Atlantic Creoles, their linguistic dexterity, cultural plasticity, and social agility were precisely those qualities that the sugar planters of the New World feared the most. For their labor force, planters desired youth and strength, not experience and wisdom. Not too much knowledge might be subversive to the good order of the plantation. Simply put, men and women who understood the operations of the Atlantic system, included the slave trade, were too dangerous to be trusted in the human tinderboxes created by the sugar revolution. Rejected by most prosperous New World regimes, Atlantic Creoles were frequently exiled to marginal slave societies where would-be slave owners, unable to compete with plantation magnates, snapped up those whom the grandees had disparaged as refuge for reasons of age, illness, or criminality. In the 17th century, few New World slave societies were more marginal than those of mainland North America. The Atlantic Creoles were among the first Africans transported to the mainland. They became Black America's marginal slave societies, where it would be. Well, hold on. I think I might have messed up there. Oh, transported to the mainland. They became Black America's charter generations. Excuse me. Atlantic Creoles began reviving in Americas in the 16th century. Some accompanied the conquistadors, marching with Balboa, Cortez, De Soto, and Pizarro. Right, so this sound like a lot of Moors. Like, what's the dude's name? Is his name Esteban, or is it Esteban or something like that? Who was out there in New Mexico, and Arizona? He kind of like mapped it out for them. But you had a lot of these Moors traveling with them, right? And then you hear about the Moors with Columbus. So what if these Atlantic Creoles is another way? Is a way of acknowledging these are like the Moors, I believe. All that Moorish shit come from these motherfuckers right here. So that's just me. Like, to me, Moors are Atlantic Creoles. Atlantic Creoles are Moors. That's what I'm putting together. So you see, the Moors always say that they like create this system, right? This court system, this maritime law system that we all under now, right? And they always like to like throw that in everybody's faces. That's why they got all these treaties and shit, right? So don't this what they sound with the Atlantic Creole sound exactly the same what the Moors been talking about and shit. The white men don't like to acknowledge the Atlantic Creoles. I mean the Moors and shit, right? But they can acknowledge them as being Atlantic Creoles, right? These mixed race people who understood all three societies better than, let's say, just one of like Europeans or Africans or Native Americans, right? They understood the whole. They created their own system, their whole Atlantic system. That is like bigger than just being from Africa or America or Europe or whatever, right? It's the system that's in between, and that's kind of what our court system and everything is about, right? I don't want to go too far off topic, but it's just crazy. I didn't want to let that thought go out of my mind. But think about it. When I say Atlantic Creoles, think about the Moors. Just put them as interchangeable. Others traveled on their own as sailors and interpreters in both the transatlantic and African trades. Again, we heard about the Moors interpreting for the Portuguese and all these people here, right? Whatever they want, Atlantic Creoles employed their distinctive language, planted their unique institutions of the Creole community, and propagated their social outlook within the Portuguese and Spanish empires. They created an intercontinental web of cofradias, so that by the 17th century, sorry if I repeat the same thing because it's just the way the page cuts off. 17th century network of Black religious brotherhood stretched from Lisbon, Portugal, to Sao Tome, Angola, and Brazil. Although no comparable institution linkage existed in the Anglo and Franco-American worlds, there were numerous informal connections between Black people in New England and Virginia, Louisiana, and Saint Domingue, or Haiti, Santo Domingo, right? Like their African counterparts, Atlantic Creoles of the European, South American, and Caribbean origins also became part of Black America's charter generations. Whether tragedy befell them, the Atlantic Creoles did not arrive in the New World as deracinated chattel stripped of their past and without resources to meet the future. Unlike those who followed them into slavery, succeeding generations and transported Creoles were not designated by diminutives or divisively named after ancient notables or classical deities, or burdened with the tags more appropriate to boneyard animals than to human beings. Instead, their names provided concrete evidence that they carried a good deal more than dignity to the Americas, right? To such men and women, New Amsterdam, fortified port controlled by the Dutch West India Company and Dutch colonial province of New Netherlands, was not radically different from Elmina. Save for its smaller size and colder climate, its population was a farrago of petty traders, artisans, merchants, soldiers, and corporate functionaries, all scrambling for the status and frontier milieu that demanded intercultural exchange. Atlantic Creoles found themselves very much at home in their new environment. Rather than losing their skills, they discovered that the value of their gift for intellectual or intercultural negotiation appreciated. The transatlantic journey did not break Creole communities, it only transported them to other sites. Along the edges of the North American continent, Creoles found that their cultural and social marginality was an asset. Slaveholders learned that the ability of the Creoles to negotiate with the diverse populace of 17th century North America was as valuable as their labor, perhaps more so. While their owners employed Creole skills on their own behalf, Creoles did the same for themselves, trading their knowledge for a place in the still undefined social order. In 1665, when Jan Angola, accused of stealing wood, could not address the New Amsterdam court in Dutch, he was ordered to return the following day with Domingo the Negro as an interpreter, an act familiar to Atlantic Creoles in Elmina, Lisbon, San Salvador, in modern-day El Salvador, or Cape Francois, and or Cape Francis in Haiti, which is now Cape Cachan. To be sure, slavery bore heavily on Atlantic Creoles in the New World, as in Africa and Europe. It was a system of exploitation, subservience, and debasement that rested on force. Yet Atlantic Creoles were familiar with the servitude of forms ranging from unbridled exploitation to corporate familiarism. They had known free people to be enslaved and had known slaves to be liberated. The boundary between slavery and freedom on the African coast was permeable. Servitude generally did not prevent men and women from marrying, acquiring property. Slaves included enjoying a modest prosperity and even being incorporated into a whole society. Creoles transported across the Atlantic had no reason to suspect they could not do the same in the New World if the stigma of servitude, physical labor, and uncertain lineage and alien religion branded them as outsiders. There were many others in North America, men and women, unblemished European pedigree prominent among them, who shared those taints. That black people could and occasionally hold slaves in service and employ white people suggested that race, like lineage and religion, was just one of many markers in social order. The experience of the Atlantic Creoles provided strategies for containing the abuse and degradation of slavery, even when in freedom. Although the routes to social advancement were many and generally involved reattachment to a community through the agency of an influential patron, or better yet, an established institution. Freedom was measured by the degree of communal integration, not by the ability to secure individual autonomy. Along the coast of Africa, Atlantic Creoles often identified with the appendages of European or African power, or the international mercantile corporations or local chieftains, in hopes of relieving the stigmas of others, be it enslavement, bastard birth, paganism, or race. They employed the strategy repeatedly in mainland North America as they tried to clear the hurdles of social and cultural difference and establish a place for themselves. Many slaves gained freedom. This was not easy in New Netherlands, although there was no legal prescription on manumission. Far more than any other mainland colony during the first half of the 17th century, New Netherlands rested on slave labor and manumission. Manumission was calculated to the benefit of slave owners, not slaves. Indeed, gaining freedom was nearly impossible for slaves owned privately and difficult even for those owned by the West India Company. The company valued the slaves and was willing to liberate only the elderly, whom it viewed as a liability, even when manumission with slaves. Such slaves, the company exacted an annual tribute from adults and retained ownership of their children. To the West India Company's former slaves who were unable to pass their new status onto their children, this half freedom appeared to be no freedom at all. Hearing rumors that baptism would assure freedom to their children, they pressured their claims to church membership. Conversion never guaranteed freedom in New Netherlands. Many half-free blacks achieved their goal. By the time of the English conquest, about one black person in 5 had achieved freedom in New Amsterdam. Some free people of African descent prospered in building on small gifts of land that the West India Company provided as freedom dues. A few entered the landholding class. By the middle of the 17th century, Atlantic Creoles participated in almost every aspect of life in New Netherland. In addition to marrying and baptizing children, Dutch Reformed Church, they sued and were sued in Dutch courts and fought alongside Dutch militiamen against the colony's enemies, black men and women, enslaved as well as free, traded independently and accumulated property. But even in linking themselves to the most important edifices of nascent European American societies, Atlantic Creoles struggled to become a part of the social order where exclusion or otherness, not subordination, could threaten all other gains. To be inferior within the sharply stratified world of the 17th century was a common and therefore understandable experience. Be the other and excluded posed unparalleled dangers. As a result, black men and women began to develop a variety of institutions that reflected their unique experience and served their special needs. They stood as godparents to one another's children, developing close family ties, and really called on white people, owners or not, to serve in this capacity. At times, established black families legally adopted orphan black children, further knitting the black community together in a web of constructed kinship. All right. And again, this is only an excerpt from Generations Captivity, A History of African American Slaves by Ira Berlin. All right, we can go into the name of this dude. Published by Harvard University Press, 2003. All right, all rights reserved. All rights reserved.